So throughout the book, there are very direct and also some indirect connections between Bowie, the novel A Buddha of Suburbia, and also I'll get to this in just a moment, but also to Baudrillard and his text on America and what he noticed as sort of a case study of America. So Bowie is mentioned multiple times throughout the novel in very direct ways. They talk about him. He actually attended the school that Charlie and Karim go to. So he has a very, even though he's not physically there, a physical presence as a picture on the wall. And he becomes an icon, almost an idol that these boys are like praying to. And what they're praying for, we don't really know. Maybe fame, maybe fortune, but he's definitely there and he's a focal point for these boys at this time in their lives. So he's mentioned in that way. His music is mentioned, and he's also really a major part of the novel in terms of how much of a chameleon he was in the way that he was able to take on different personas, the way that he was able to be Ziggy Stardust. He was also able to be the Thin White Duke. He was able to be Aladdin Sane. He took on all these different personalities. He changed the different masks, and that helped with his fame. So Charlie uses that same process to become Charlie Hero and become a really hardcore punk rocker wearing the spiked hair and all the tight black clothing and the safety pins. He even wears the swastika at one point, which Eva is very upset about, but it doesn't mean the same thing to him that it does to her. There was a little bit of that in the Parker reading about the meaning of signs and how it changes based on how they're used. But I don't want to delve too much into that. But just this idea of signs and representation and symbolism, Bowie is not only a symbol to the boys in the novel of what they could be. Charlie actually becomes, obviously he doesn't become David Bowie exactly, but he becomes a version of him in that he uses that ability to put on different identities to his advantage, and he becomes famous because of that. He doesn't really become these people, these different personas or personalities, but he's able to take advantage of that ability that he has in order to gain great fame and a really intense following of people too. It also takes over him a little bit though, and some of the songs in Bowie's later albums talked about trying to deal with that fame and the attention. And we know we've talked a lot about his drug usage as a result of the pressures of being famous. And we see Charlie fall to this a little bit with the violence that he experiences towards the reporter, which is a little bit persona, probably a little bit lashing out, as well as the sadomasochistic scene that eventually drives Karim away from Charlie in New York. The last part of this that I wanted to talk about is really one of the last things, or the last conversation between Charlie and Karim, where Karim wants to go back to London and Charlie doesn't want him to leave. And this really reminded me of when we read that bit from, and it was in Dr. Lee's lesson also, that bit from Baudrillard where he talks about the excess of America, how there's so much you can get anything you want at any time, but it's an excess and it's too much and it's overwhelming to the point that you can't even make a decision. And it seems that Charlie is just continuing to look for happiness and pleasure in different ways because now he has all this money and he can. And he is in really stark contrast to Karim, who just wants to go back home. He wants to go back to London. He has an idea, at least at this moment, of what he wants. Whereas Charlie, in this land of excess, can't quite figure out what he wants to do, and he doesn't understand Karim wanting to go to London, but he also fundamentally doesn't understand this idea of Karim knowing what he wants, it seems. Just the idea also of London versus New York City of America versus England. It was interesting reading this book as an American. I think it would be interesting in very different ways to read it as someone living in England, someone living in London, someone living in India. Because to me, in the novel, America is positioned as this land of optimism and hope, where Charlie really positions it as if you can make it here, you can make it anywhere, right? That famous saying. And he says he has a lot more optimism here, he's a lot more hopeful, that people don't push him down like they did back in London. And it's just interesting that the two countries are positioned that way. It also seems like London and England are portrayed as places where there's a lot of racism and there's a lot of racial tension and a lot of class issues, which it seems like there are based on the novel and the research that we've been doing. But I don't think those are absent in America or other places. But it seems like from the portrayal that they are. So I thought that was really interesting. And I would be interested to hear how someone living in a different country experiences that reading, because I think although we've talked about postmodernism and things being decontextualized, I think the context in this specific instance is really important for how you read and interpret the messaging that comes from this novel.